Greetings from the Tech Cave. Fenris here, and today we are taking a look at this. This is a bootleg copy of Puzzle de Pon for the Neo Geo MVS. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, why does that matter? It's just a bootleg Neo Geo game. Well, what matters not is the fact that it's a bootleg, but rather what is inside the bootleg. And in fact, if we were to open this up, which I already have the 4 Phillips screws removed here, we would see that it has a set of EPROMs and mask ROMs. Now the EPROMs are not relevant, that's just containing the Puzzle de Pon ROM set. What does matter, however, is these, the mask ROMs. Now if you take a look at the mask ROMs, they each start with a 3-digit code 096. Now if we were to go on Google and type in NGH-096, we would find that this copy of Puzzle de Pon was once a copy of Art of Fighting 3. Now, Art of Fighting 3 is a bit of a tricky game to find on Neo Geo MVS, and when it does come up, it's usually around like $150, $200. Not really that expensive for Neo Geo standards, but you know, it's still a little bit pricey. So, these copies of Puzzle de Pon can be usually found for like around $40, $50. Now, granted, they aren't all like this, but the point is, this copy is. And the reason why that's important is because this means that we can potentially revive this game back into being Art of Fighting 3. And in fact, that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. Now, what I have here is a custom Art of Fighting 3 label that I made, and the missing ROM set needed to convert this Puzzle de Pon back into Art of Fighting 3. And as well, I have a nice black shell to go along with it. So, without further delay, let's get started. So now that we have the cartridge taken apart, we can now take a look at the 2 boards that make up a Neo Geo game. So this board right here is the prog board. This contains your P-ROMs and V-ROMs. The P-ROMs are just your general programming data, while the V-ROMs contain like voice samples, music instruments, and what have you. Basically, most of the audio data is contained in here. This here is the CHA board. This contains your C-ROMs or character ROMs, the M1 ROM, which is actually the Z80 data, so that way the Z80 has a point of reference to pull audio from the V-ROMs, and the S1 ROM. Now the S1 ROM is just fixed layer graphical data. So that's gonna be like your HUD, you know, your health bar, timer, credits screen, what have you. And that's basically what makes up a Neo Geo game. Now, in terms of what needs to be replaced, it's going to be all of these EPROMs here. So, and that's exactly what I have here. I have C1, C2, C3, and C4. C1, C2, C3, and C4. I have M1 and S1, M1 and S1, which we are going to have to do some modifications to S1, and I'll get to that later. But before we get to that, we're going to be first focusing on the prog board. And the only 2 chips that we're going to be replacing are these 2, and that's going to be your P1 and V1. So without further delay, let's get this board out of the way, and let's zoom into this one. Okay, so we are nice and zoomed in here to the prog board, and simply put, all we're gonna do in terms of removing these ROMs is we're just going to run some fresh solder along these pins here. Obviously, we're gonna also use some flux, hit it with our desoldering gun, and then plop in the new ROMs. But while I was examining this board, something interesting caught my eye. Now, if you take a look here, you can see how all these other ROMs are straight, except for P2 here. And in fact, let's just get a little closer. You can see that it's kinda crooked. Now, I'm not sure exactly why my P2 ROM here is stick bugging, but that's enough to bother me. I'm pretty sure it does work, but I just don't like how that looks. So in addition, I'm going to also remove this and see if I can straighten out those pins. So without further delay, let's get to it. Alright, bit of a struggle there, but I did manage to remove P1, P2, and V1. Now, the reason why I was struggling a little bit with P2 is because, if you look here, some of these pins are bent inward. And what I had to do in order to get it out was I had to take my flush cuts and not cut them off, but just grab them and bend them just enough to where they will pop out of the holes. You never want to force chips out of the holes if they're not ready. However, if you are able to see that when you do the wiggle test that the pins are loose, then that means that they are ready to come out. It's just they may require a little bit of manual coaxing in order to get out, if you will. So let me see if I can just straighten this out real quick. Yeah, it looks like I can probably fold that side inward. Oh, these are like super bent. Yeah, I can push this side in. It's a little tricky to see from my side, but it looks like it's mostly straight. And this side needs to be pulled out some. You want to be careful. You don't want to accidentally snap anything. I think I might have got it for the most part. Yeah, it looks like I was able to kind of straighten out those legs. All I would need to do at that point to finish straightening out is take some needle nose pliers here and just flatten out each pin. Well, you get the picture. I'm just going to flatten out each of these pins with my needle nose pliers, and we can reinstall this P2. But more importantly, we can then install these two ROMs here, our replacement V1 and our replacement P1. And there is something that I should note about this board, but in the meantime, let's see if we can get these V1s and P1s installed. So let's get to it. All right, so as you can see there, P2 is back in its landing there. And while not perfect, it does certainly look a lot better than when we started. So with that out of the way, we can now turn our attention to P1 and V1. All right, so as you can see here, this is P1. This is flashed on a 27C8100. This is a one-time programmable ROM chip. And yes, that does mean that we cannot reflash this chip at any time, but that's perfectly fine. The purpose of this chip is to serve as a mask ROM replacement, so big deal. As for V1 on the other hand, this is flashed on a 29F1615. This is an electrically erasable ROM chip, so we can reflash it at any time, but really I'm not gonna. Now, that being said, you might be wondering, why did I go for these instead of their EPROM equivalents, that being the 27C800 and the 27C160? Well, that mainly just boils down to the fact that when I bought these chips, there wasn't really that much of a price difference between their EPROM equivalents and these. And unfortunately, it is getting a little harder to find EPROMs that still work. I mean, you can buy them off AliExpress, but it's a total crapshoot. So, you know, I might as well go for something that I feel would probably be just a little bit more, how you say, long-lasting. So with that out of the way, there's only one more thing that we have to check, and that's all these jumpers here. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into what all these jumpers do, but needless to say, we need to make sure that these jumpers are configured correctly to match Art of Fighting 3. If any of them were altered in any way to match Puzzle de Pon instead, it may cause some issues when we go to play this game. So looking at this board here, and comparing it to the scans that we can find of Art of Fighting 3 from MVS-scans.com, None of the jumpers seem to have been altered in any way, so we should be good to go in terms of installing our P1 and V1 ROM chips. So with that out of the way, let's get to it. Okay, so before we install these into our board, we want to also do one more thing, and that's inspect the pins themselves. Now, granted, I did buy these from a reputable seller. Unfortunately, when it comes to stuff like the EEP ROMs, EP ROMs, and what have you, they often sell them as used items, so you don't really know whether or not they have clean pins, and if they don't, you're going to find that you have a hard time soldering them directly onto the board. And in the event that you do have some corroded pins, what I like to do is take a dull craft knife here and just lightly brush on the pins. Now, I'm pretty sure this would have been fine to solder directly on, but as you can see, it makes a world of difference when you do that. And yeah, you basically just want to do that on each side. This side, inside, and even the sides of the pins. And you just do that really quick, and that's all it really takes to make these ROM chips ready to go for soldering on the board. So I'm gonna go ahead and scrape up these pins, and then we'll move on to the soldering portion. Okay, just one more thing, and I swear we will get to soldering. But you may notice that the pins on your ROM chips might be like fanned out a bit. So this is gonna make things a little bit trickier in terms of like soldering them direct to the board because, well, if we were to just take the board here, you know, they're not gonna fit really well when they don't line up with the holes, right? Well, the way that we fix this is simple. We just take the chip and just do a slight bend to them. Don't want to go too far, otherwise they'll be too sunken in. And if you do that just right, you should have all the pins straightened out. So they should land much smoother. So let's not delay it. Let's get to soldering. All right, and with that, the ROM chips are now fully installed. Now, aside from some cleaning work, this is basically done. So yeah, we don't need to focus on the prog board anymore. We can now move on to the CHA board. Now, something I wanted to bring up really quick before we move on is You may have noticed that after I had tacked in the chips themselves, I came back later with the soldering iron and it looked like all I was doing was just retacking them. What I was actually doing was, while I was retouching them with a soldering iron, I was applying pressure to the chip itself. That way I was making sure that the ROM chips were as flush to the board as possible. So yeah, something to keep in mind when installing new chips or replacement chips. Granted, it may not be that big of a deal as long as they are connected. I just prefer to do that so it actually looks kind of clean. And speaking of clean, I do need to take this board aside and clean it with some isopropyl to get all that flux off. But we can now move forward with the child board. Okay, so the same basic principles with the prog board also apply to the child board. You know, that being we gotta remove the Puzzle de Pawn EP ROMs and replace them with our new ROMs. But more importantly, if you remember earlier, I mentioned how you have to pay attention to the jumpers. And in this case, something was altered on this board in terms of the jumper settings. Now, if we were to take a look at an original Art of Fighting 3 child board, we would see that J11 and J12 were relocated to R1 and R2. So some adjustments were made to accommodate for the Puzzle de Pawn ROM set. Now, that's not really any big deal. All we gotta do is just remove R1 and R2 and place them back in J11 and J12. But before we do all that though, let's talk about the ROMs that we're using. Okay, so like before, we're gonna be taking a look at the ROM chips that we're going to be replacing. So that being C1, C2, C3, C4, as well as M1 and S1. Now, C1 to C4 are 27C322 EP ROMs. Now, you might be wondering as to why I didn't bother using OTP or EEP ROM equivalents like I did with the prog board. And the reason why is those don't exist for the 27C322. Now, that being said, my friend Bucket Mouse did recently create a 27C322 replacement that uses dual 29F160 flash modules. Now, the reason why I'm not looking at that right now is because I have had these ROMs as well as the cartridge itself since 2021. So yeah, it's been a bit since I've taken a look at this cartridge, but you know, time flies. Now, you may also notice S1 has a couple of wires poking out of it. And the reason why that is because these are both W27CO10s, which are the EEPROM equivalents to the 27CO10. And the reason why that's relevant is because M1 uses 27CO10s or 27C1001s, while S1 uses 27C1000 EP ROMs. Now, the 27C1000 is a non-JEDEC spec chip. Now, JEDEC is a manufacturing standard for ICs that I'm not going to really get into for this video because it's not really relevant, but what is relevant is the pinouts are not the same. So the only difference between an S1 and an M1 is pins 2 and 24. So to make a 27C1001 or a 27C010 work as an S1 chip for Neo Geo cartridges, all you need to do is swap pin 2 and 24. And as you see, I did just that. So with that out of the way, let's get these out of the way and get the old ROMs removed. Okay, so unfortunately, it does look like as if there is a damaged pad here. I don't believe this was from the soldering process. I think this was just already a broken pad that was just kind of barely holding on to dear life, but that's perfectly fine. I can see that this pad here goes to this via right here. So what I can probably do is expose a bit of this via and run a 30-AUG Kynar wire from this via to this pin. So just going to make a mental note of that when I insert the new ROMs. But more importantly, this board is, other than that, ready to go. I just got to move these two jumpers here, and then we can just go on with transplanting the ROMs. So let's get to it. Okay, so we are up close and personal to this area of the board, and like I mentioned, we need to move R1 and R2 back to J11 and J12 in order for our Art of Fighting 3 ROM set to work correctly. So, the way I like to go about doing it is pretty simple. I just apply a little bit of flux across the way. And we don't need to run the hot air rework station for this one. We can actually just move it with our soldering iron and a knife tip. So all we do is touch each side, make sure they go molten. And using our tweezers as like a guide, we're just going to, probably could add a little bit more solder though, just to make it easier. But using our tweezers as a guide, we're going to carefully move it up. Okay. It's a little crooked. Let me see if I can try to fix that a bit. There we go. Kind of, but you get the picture. So let's also do that to R1. There we go. I might straighten it up a bit more off camera, but just to make sure that these resistors are still good, these are actually 0 ohm chip resistors. So technically I could just use a piece of resistor leg to replace them, but let's make sure that these are still good. So they should short. Yep. And yes. So those are still good. And with that, the board prep is basically done. Now we just need to transplant our replacement ROMs and also patch up that damaged via that I noted earlier. So let's get to it. Okay, so we're nice and zoomed in to the one through hole that was damaged while we were removing all the solder from the ROM chips here. And I can see here that what we can do is we can scrape up the solder mask here and along here and run a 30-odd Kynar to kind of lock this in place. So I could run a jumper wire from where this connects to the next point, but I think that would look a little tacky, so let's try to see if we could do a much cleaner job. Just gonna take my craft knife here. Actually using the camera this time instead of looking at it myself. You probably saw earlier that I kept pulling the board out of frame, and that was mainly just so I could check my joints to make sure everything was okay. You know, this board is like a whole 1 foot away from me, so it's a little bit difficult to get a close look at everything. Let me just take a look at this here. Needs a little bit more scraping, but that should be good. Now let's see if we can do it through this via here. It's gonna be a little trickier. Hindsight's 2020. I probably should have done this while the ROM chip was off. Let me closer look again. Yeah. I was able to expose that leg there and this trace here. So we should be good. It's just a little bit of flux on both sides. Grab some 30-AUG Kynar wire here. Just gonna try to strip some of it. That should just about do it. And let me see if I can start from the via here. I have to blur the camera. This is like super fine work. Oh, almost. Nope. I have to scrape off a little bit more of that mask. Go. That should be adequate. Yep, there we go. Now we are just going to carefully angle it like so. Let's see. Sorry if I'm like moving this around a lot. I want to make sure that I get a good shot of what I'm doing. But basically, what we're gonna do, making sure to not overlay the trace here on any of the other through holes, which would cause a short. We are gently guiding this over here. Just gonna press this down. Kind of straighten that out a bit. Apply a little bit of flux. And try not to burn my finger, but we can. Do the wiggle test. Yep, that's good. I'm just gonna come in with my dull craft knife and apply just a little bit of pressure. You don't want to force it all the way down. You just want enough pressure to where you're just holding it. That way you can just break it off. Okay, so let's make sure that we're getting continuity from this via to, where does this trace end? That pin right there. I'm gonna bust out my multimeter here. And on the other side of the room for some reason. So this pin actually looks like it connects here. It does. Let's make sure. Yep. Next to the other side. And just to make sure it's not bridging anywhere else. It's not. Good. So next we're just going to clean up this area a bit with some isopropyl here. And the reason why is because before we solder it in place to that pin, we're going to be applying some UV curing mask. And we don't want any flux to be hiding underneath it. No, this is like a pretty long segment. I do apologize. I like to try something new every time I film one of these. Okay, that. See a little hair right there. There we go. So the flux is gone. Now we just need to apply a bit of UV cure resin. We don't need like a ton. Oh, crap. Yeah, my vial likes to gush out a bit. Actually, let me see if we can just use the tweezers here to kind of Spread some of this goo around. There we go. Does look like I got a bit on the pins, but that's not too big of a deal. What matters is we get that trace all patched up. Now we just come in. And that should be solid. It is. Good. Now for the final step, which is soldering on that pin. That is simply done like so. And there we go. Not the prettiest job, but we got it all patched up. So other than that, this is basically complete. We just got to clean it up and throw it in the Neo Geo to give it a good test. Okay, so we're right here in front of the Super Gun setup. I got the Art of Fighting 3 ROM set all plugged in, and I got the Haas Super Gun plugged into the MV-1FZ. And yeah, we're just going to fire this up and give it a shot. Now, you might be wondering as to why I didn't put a shell on this, and that's mainly because I wanted to test the boards prior to committing to a shell and label. Now, as far as how we plug these in, you know, like direction-wise, we can actually see it based on this. This is my copy of Fatal Fury Special, and as you can see, the prog board goes on the top slot, while the CHA board goes on the bottom slot. And the easiest way to remember that, in fact, let's just remove these, is there's a little arrow on the sled here, and that arrow should line up with the arrow of the cartridge. So, should go in like that. Now, for top loading systems like the MV-1C, there we go, it's a little tight. It would line up like this, since the arrow would be positioned forward and the cartridge would be going in, I guess you can kind of say, backwards. So, with that out of the way, let's plug these boards back in. So, starting with the CHA board. Next, the prog board. It's a little tricky to do this one-handed, but I can manage. Click on the power, kill the lights. And as you can see, we are booting into the Unibios menu. Actually, let's see if we can get nice and loud. So far, so good. Ooh! Okay, let's kill the power and get the lights on. So, I'm pretty sure you just heard that, but graphically speaking, we're fine, but audio-wise, it sounds a little messy, and that would indicate that either V2 or V3 are going bad. Now, we know that it's not the jumper settings because we already checked that earlier, and while I was soldering the chips into the board, I did do a thorough visual inspection to make sure that there were no broken traces, so we can confirm that it's nothing wrong with the board side. It's going to be either V2 or V3. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to remove V2 and V3, get these dumped, and compare them to a MAME ROM set and see which one is missing data or has corrupted data. So let's get to it. Okay, so since I'm dumber than a bag of peanuts and forgot to switch my microphone when filming the dumping segment, I decided that I'm just going to break down how exactly I go about doing it. So what I have here is the GQ4X4 Universal Programmer with an adapter that interfaces off of DIP40 and DIP42 ROM chips. Now, what I do is when I go to the programmer, I make sure it is set to a specific EPROM type depending on what size the original files are supposed to be. In the case of the VROMs for Art of Fighting 3, they are 2 megabytes in size. So I make sure the programmer is set to 27C160. From there, I just for visual representation, I just drop in the original mask ROM, lock it down, and have it read its contents, and then save it. And I do that 2 or 3 times just to make sure that I get a clean dump. And then from there, I take the MAME ROM set and then run both the known good dump and the MAME dump, and I compare them using a bit of software called HXD Editor, which allows me to edit and compare the ROM files via hexadecimal code. And what I found was V3 was coming up with a lot of corrupted bits. So V3 was my culprit, and as you can see, I have the original V3 on the V4 socket, which is perfectly fine as long as you remove the 2 jumpers here. It will make sure that the board does not attempt to interface off of the V4 socket. But more importantly, I don't have any more 29F1615s on hand, so temporarily, I decided to use one of my 27C160s here, and it's kind of whatever, but you know what? I got V3 replaced, and now the audio is working, and I will demonstrate that in a little bit. But one other thing that I want to bring up, and you'll notice it when I'm reassembling the cartridge, is I also had to replace M1. This is more of a user error on my end. Initially, I thought that perhaps M1 was the culprit, so I removed the original, and unfortunately, it turned out the M1 chip that I had was corrupted. It would not read on my program whatsoever, and I couldn't even reflash it. And that's just kind of the unfortunate reality when we're talking about dealing with used chips. You never know just how much longer they have to last, and that's not the fault of Buy IC Now, it's just the reality of dealing with older chips. So with all that out of the way, I'm going to go back to the Super Gun. We're going to plug in both of these boards here, and then, yeah, we should be good to go. All right, so we got the Art of Fighting 3 boards all plugged into my Super Gun setup here. So we're just going to kill the lights, hit the switch, booting into UniVios. And that sounds a lot better. But you get the picture. So yeah, this is now a fully working Art of Fighting 3 board set. So now all we need to do is get it in a shell, put a new label on, and that basically would be the conclusion there. All right, so we have our replacement cartridge shell here, and even though it's in pretty rough shape, this is an official SNK produced cartridge shell. And I know I could get replacement shells that would look much nicer, but I like to use official SNK shells with genuine carts or repaired cartridges even. As for my bootlegs, I like to give those new shells that differentiate greatly from official shells. Now, granted, you could argue that perhaps this isn't like super original anymore, but considering the fact that the mask ROMs are still present, I would class this as a repair. But that's just me personally. Now, something to note when putting together an MVS cartridge. You have this little cartridge guard here, and it is not centered. And the reason why is because if you remember from our Fatal Fury Special cartridge, the CHA board goes on the bottom while the prog board lays on top. And that's exactly what this guard is for. It's to help guide the two cartridge PCBs back into the shell. In fact, let me just show you. Now, if you don't put this together correctly, you'll feel it that it's not assembled right because this will start to bow, or just the cartridge won't close correctly. But as you can see, we got the CHA board in. Then we just come in with the prog board, like so. And you can even see like how there are some plastic tabs that kind of lock everything in place too. Which, if you ever buy some of the replacements, they might end up with those tabs being a little too, wide. So you may have to do some trimming. But in this case, it's an official shell. Everything just clicks in place. So now we're just going to take our 4 screws. And this is just a general tip when screwing things back in, but you want to first start by turning the screwdriver counterclockwise so you feel a click, and then screw it in. You only want it to be finger tight. You don't want it to be super tight. And the reason I do this is to reset the screw so I don't create new threads. Because if you create new threads, you run the risk of stripping the screw hole. And if you strip the screw hole, well, you can't screw it back together. Now, there are ways to repair the screw hole, but if there's a way to prevent that, I prefer to prevent that. Now, we got the cartridge put back together. Now all that's left is to put on a new label. And what I have here is a custom label that I designed for this purpose. Now, whenever you get a stock Neo Geo MVS cartridge, I'm just walking over to my collection here just to grab one. This will do. I can just get it out of my shelf. You'll usually end up with something like this. This is just like a generic label with the game's title and may or may not have the serial numbers. Depending on where you purchase your cartridges from, they usually remove it due to laws in their country. But I thought those look a little plain, so what I like to do is whenever the label is like too far gone or there's just no label at all, I like to create these custom labels to give it just a little bit more flair. So just get this filled up. Try to center it as best as possible so it doesn't overlay on the edge. And then we're gonna gently, that didn't center right. This part's always a little tricky. Just trying to deviate onto the corner there. All right, there we go. And with that, we now have a nice Art of Fighting 3 cartridge that's ready to go. And yeah, that's really it. I really appreciate you all sticking around and watching this video. I know I was a little sloppy at parts. It's been a little over a month since I actually decided to film a project on camera. So if I was a little shaky or messy in parts, I do apologize. I'm still trying to get used to this whole, filming myself doing these kinds of tech work, if you will. But yeah, with that being said, this is a now clean and ready to go cartridge. And yeah, if you liked what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. I do have some more content coming along the way. And yeah, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.